What's up, Buckeye fans? It's Patrick Murphy from Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports here with you for another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. Today, we are going to veer away from what we normally talk about, which is predominantly football, and do a little college basketball, specifically Ohio State basketball discussion. I know that most of the audience are football people, and obviously there's plenty to talk about with that. The BM5 has done a great job of covering everything that's gone on during spring practice. And while there's plenty to talk about, the Final Four is this weekend. And so I thought it was a good time to do a little college basketball talk. And the focus of this is going to be one thing that Ohio State can learn from each of the Final Four teams. I did this with the college football playoff semifinalists, and I thought that podcast went well. I thought people responded pretty well to it. So I'm going to look at what Ohio State men's basketball, can learn from these teams. I think that there's probably more to take away from what these teams have done in the Final Four than there is with the football program, which is obviously in a different place. Obviously won the national championship the year prior. So I think this will be a interesting discussion, and I'm curious to see what people think about it coming out of the other end. Before we get into it, please remember, if you are watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Hit that thumbs up button, hit the bell for notifications. This not only helps us, but it gets you all of our videos, not just these podcasts, but we've had plenty of interviews, had more today. I'm recording this on Thursday, April 2nd. We've had plenty of video interviews with Ohio State players, football players throughout spring practice, and there will be plenty more. So make sure you have done that so you get all of our content that goes up on YouTube. If you're listening to this on your podcast platform of choice, please make sure to give a 5-star review and leave us comments. All of that is helpful for us to continue to grow this channel. And this is not something I normally say, but if you know somebody who doesn't, is unaware of our channel or our podcasts or whatnot, spread the word. We'd love to build our YouTube channel further than it is. I know a lot of people know Bucknuts and our message boards and our recruiting coverage and the coverage we do with the team sites and all that. We've got just under 18,000 subscribers on Bucknuts on the YouTube page. So, if we could grow that number, that'd be great. We're at a good spot. This YouTube page hasn't been around all that long. So keep it growing. Let people know. Share the stuff. All of that stuff is very helpful for us to continue to do what we do. But let's get into it. So Ohio State men's basketball. It's kind of a polarizing topic, especially during the tournament. The Buckeyes were back in March Madness this year, but did not win their first round game. Lost TCU in a close one. I know there was a lot of disappointment coming out of that. I know there's been a lot of disappointment about kind of the direction of the program. But I think that there is certainly room for positivity. And I'm going to get to some of the kind of what we're hearing about the program at the end. But first, I want to go through each of the Final Four teams and what I think Ohio State can take away from them. So your Final Four teams, obviously Michigan, UConn, Illinois, and Arizona. I assume you all know that, unless you have not been paying attention to the NCAA tournament, which I guess is a possibility. So I think there is at least something to take away from each of them. And there's going to be some overlap, I think, with some of this discussion. But I think it's interesting nonetheless, and I hope you do as well. So we'll start. Let's get this one out of the way first, because I know this is the one that people will like the least. But Michigan. And what Ohio State can learn from them. I think it comes down to a purpose-driven transfer portal rebuild. Remember a couple years ago, Michigan football was not, or excuse me, Michigan basketball. Michigan football was good a couple years ago. They have not been as good the last 2 years. But 2 seasons ago, Michigan went 8-24. This last year, they went 27-10 and lost in the regional semifinal. And then this year, 35-3. And I know the first thing that people are going to want to talk about is Dusty May and Ohio State's decision to go with Jake Diebler over Dusty May. That is a real thing. You can't deny what Dusty May's done. They're in very different situations or different places in their careers. Jake Diebler being a first-time coach, and Dusty May having been through this, been to a Final Four before. We can debate whether or not Ohio State made the right choice or not, but that's not the purpose of this conversation, because you're not going to go back and change that right now. Dusty May's the coach at Michigan, so you're not going to learn a ton from that. But what you can do is how they approached the transfer portal and turned that program around so quickly, from 8 wins 2 years ago and building up to what they did as maybe the best team in the country this past year. If you look at Michigan's key players, Yaxel Lendenborg, the Big Ten Player of the Year, Andy Mara and Marez Johnson Jr., Elliot Godot, all of those guys were part of Michigan's transfer class this past season. They hit on all four, and it has been a huge, building block to what they've accomplished, giving them a roster with an incredibly high floor, and elite two-way efficiency without having to have this time to develop chemistry and all of that. You look at Lindenborg in particular, because he has been the best of the bunch. A guy who is highly productive at UAB, but he became an elite player at Michigan. Playing in the Big Ten, and like I said, Big Ten Player of the Year, consensus first team All-American. They have, to say they struck gold would be an understatement. Look, Lindenberg was a 5-star prospect in the transfer portal, in the transfer rankings, I should say. So, an obvious guy to go after. But you look at these other guys, Marez Johnson was a guy Ohio State had on campus, was interested in the Buckeyes when he was looking around. And that's the type of guy that I think now the Buckeyes need to elevate to getting and building this a step further when they're going in the transfer portal. I think you saw from 2 years ago with the Sean Stewart, Aaron Bradshaw, Michi Johnson, that class, not great. They have hit on a couple guys, but I think if you can get the transfer portal right, like Michigan did this past season, it can change things very quickly. Now, it can also go the other way. And I've pointed this out to some people. What's Michigan going to look like next season? Well, they're certainly going to hit the transfer portal hard after the Final Four. But if you miss on a guy or two in college basketball, it can be a problem. And we've seen that at Ohio State. So I think finding guys that can be immediate impact guys. And I use Lindenberg as an example. He was this last year at UAB, 17.7 points per game, shooting 52.2%, 35.7% on threes. He rebounded at a high level, 11.4 per game. Yes, this was at a slightly lower level, but those are the guys that Ohio State should be going after. Now, everybody was going after Lindenberg, but finding those guys that have been productive at a lower level or productive at the Big Ten level, but maybe haven't found quite their ceiling yet, I think is going to be crucial for Ohio State to have the type of turnaround that they want. Now, this brings us to another conversation as part of this, and that is the financial part of it. Michigan not only went out and hired Dusty May 2 years ago, they committed a lot of money to men's basketball. This is a roster of guys who could be playing in the NBA. And I don't expect Ohio State to go quite that far. I do know that Ohio State expects the NIL resources to be more plentiful for Ohio State men's basketball this offseason, which I think should lead to being able, or at least being in the conversation for better transfer prospects. Now you've got to close, you've got to finish that, but having the ability to compete financially a little bit better. And, still, again, like I said, not necessarily on the level of programs that are more college basketball focused, like the Dukes and the Kentuckys of the world, or even Michigan, who, I think you can see has put more of an emphasis on basketball, whereas Ohio State knows, the bread is buttered with the football program. But if you can get closer to that with NIL, you will get closer to them on the court, assuming you get the guys right and you can flip this thing fairly quickly. And I think Ohio State has the potential to do that. And I think Michigan has shown that it doesn't have to take several recruiting classes or multiple transfer portals or anything like that. there is a way to get pretty good or really good in Michigan's case really quickly. And if you can get the right plug and play veterans in the right system, and we'll get to the system in a second, then they can get this thing turning around. And then once you do that, and we'll see how it works for Michigan, but I think once you have a team that shows success, has guys going pro and things like that, you make a run in the NCAA tournament, then that has a knock-on effect in terms of recruiting and things like that. So, I think that's something the Buckeyes need to be better in, is in the transfer portal and what they've done. With Illinois, it's for me their offensive versatility and unpredictability in the way that the Fighting Illini play. I think Brad Underwood's done a great job of building an offense that is more or less sort of matchup proof. They have, I think it's 5 players that average double figures. Let me double check that. And when you have that kind of versatility, then you're going to be pretty hard to stop. Yeah, their top 5 scorers all average at least 10.2 points per game, which you don't see at a lot of places. And it's been an interesting way that they've done it. They have a transfer like Stojakovic, who he scored 13.6 points per game on 50% shooting this year. So, a guy who was very productive coming out of the transfer portal, going back to what we were just saying. And then you have a talented freshman in Keaton Wagler, who, not a guy who was highly recruited necessarily. Let me see what we had him ranked at 247. 4-star kid, number 26 shooting guard in the country, 150 nationally. That's a guy that Ohio State can land. And in fact, Ohio State has a prospect like that, a guy who is ranked even better in Anthony Thompson coming in. So you've already got the recruiting, and I think that's one of the things Jake Diebler's done pretty well thus far is his high school recruiting, at least. So you've got a talented freshman coming in. You got another one in Alex Smith, another 4-star guy who's coming in. But blending that together, and Illinois spaces the floor, they share the ball, they hurt defenses in really any way, and that makes you very difficult to defend in March, because like Ohio State this past year, we saw it in the NCAA tournament, we saw it at times during the season. It was Bruce Thornton, and then you just kind of hope other guys step up. John Mobley Jr. certainly, Devin Royal, those guys could do it, but it was if Bruce had a bad night, it was going to be tough for Ohio State to win the game. And in the NCAA tournament, Bruce was not at his best, which is unfortunate. Obviously, that was his last game as a Buckeye, somewhat because of that. I don't think we can put all of it on Bruce, but he finished the game 10 points, 3 of 9 shooting, 4 rebounds, 4 assists. When you're so reliant on one guy, you see what happens, especially in the first half when he was struggling. So Illinois has done a good job of making this unpredictable and versatile offense that I think it's not easy. Keaton Wegler had 46 points against Purdue. That's not something that everyone is going to do. Stojakovic, as I mentioned, it has been very solid, 13.5 points, 4.5 rebounds. So if you can find that ability to be versatile, and not just have this one way you're going to attack a team, I think it makes you much harder to defend throughout the season. But specifically once you get into the NCAA tournament, where teams are really kind of, especially when you have the break between games from Saturday or Sunday to Thursday or Friday, you have that time to sort of really dive into your next round opponent or heading into the tournament. And TCU knew Bruce Thornton was the guy we got to stop. We got to cut off the head of the snake. Illinois has gotten there because they are much more, you spread it out is what I would say. And it's not just one guy. Any of these guys can go off, as evidenced by what they've done. And credit to Brad Underwood. This is not an easy thing to do, but I do think Ohio State can take a look at sort of how Illinois has been able to do that. And I know, Jake Diebler is watching a lot of these games, how they can do that and how you can sort of emulate some of that, which goes back to the first point about Michigan and hitting on some of these guys in the transfer portals because you've already got the young freshmen coming in. From UConn, I think it is the culture that UConn basketball has. And obviously, UConn was very good for a long time, but they brought in Dan Hurley, and he's turned this team into a machine. And that's probably an understatement given they won back-to-back national championships. They're a gritty team. They execute really well. While they have talent, they don't just overpower teams with talent, but they do out-tough most teams. And they have this identity of tough, never give up. You saw that in their comeback against Duke, and the way that they fight. It's just in that culture that Dan Hurley has instilled there. And it's something that I think Jake Diebler can look at and say, how do we want the Buckeye culture to be? Because I think he has an idea, but I don't know if we've seen it play out yet. And I think some of that has been the personnel he has had and some of the mistakes they've done in the transfer portal, as I mentioned before. But you have to have this identity, whether in any sport. When you think of Ohio State football, you know what you're going to get under Ryan Day, right? When you think of, I don't know, to use another example, the Boston Celtics, you know what you're going to get if you're an NBA fan. Pick your sport. Teams that have success have an identity and they stick to it. And it not only is what they do, but it's why they win. And, yes, you have to change things and you have different personnel each year and all that, but you have this identity that's the foundational piece of everything you do. And I think that is where the Buckeyes need to sort of build that. And it doesn't happen overnight. Jake Diebler is going into year 3. Dan Hurley got to UConn in 2018, and it's has obviously took some time to build that up into sort of the juggernaut again, and obviously the history behind it and all that plays a part. But he got there in 2018, missed the NCAA tournament his first 2 years, lost in the first round his next 2 years, and then it was that fourth year when they won the national championship the next year, and then lost in the second round last year. So it's not all perfect, but it does take a little bit of time. And I think Jake Diebler has to get the right guys in, to go back to the other point, in order to build that. But that has to be the foundation of everything you do. If you are recruiting, you need to be getting guys that fit what you want to do. If you're going in the transfer portal, you need to get guys that fit what you want to do, right? And I think that culture is going to be huge in determining, does this Jake Diebler, we'll call it a risk, I think is fair to say, when Ross B. York made this hire, does that pay off? Is he able to establish that? Is he able to get the players that fit what he wants to do? And I think that's the key for a lot of programs, but I think Dan Hurley and the Huskies really sort of exude that. Like, you see Dan Hurley on the sideline, his players are similar. He's not giving up. He's going wild. The players are the same way. So it starts to coach, and it's got to go throughout the team. For Arizona, it's this style of play, and this blends in with the last point of the culture. Arizona is physical. They have talent, but they control the paint. They dominate the rebounds. Then they apply a constant pressure on the rim. It's a physical game. You know what you're going to get when you play against Arizona. And I think Ohio State has that idea of what they want to be. Like, I think I know that Jake Diebler wants to be a team that plays fast, that does a lot of shooting. I've compared it to sort of like a mini Golden State Warriors. You obviously don't have those guys, the Steph Currys and guys like that at this point, but that type of style of play where you're going to play fast. You want to get shots early in the shot clock. You want to just outwork your opponent, with the pace of your play and things like that. And it hasn't happened yet. We haven't really seen that. We've seen it in bits and pieces at times, but I think ideally Ohio State would like to speed it up, shoot a lot of threes, have guys that shoot threes at a high level. And we just haven't done that. And I think Arizona is a team that knows exactly what it wants to do. Teams know what Arizona wants to do, but they're so good at it that you just can't stop them. And, they control the paint. They're physical, as I said. They do have outside shooting. But it's just, they have recruited and built this roster in a very clear way to play the way that they want to do, or that they want to play under Tommy Lloyd. And I think Ohio State really needs to take that next step towards Jake Diebler's vision of what the Buckeyes are and how they're going to play. You can't just force it. And I think, as good as Bruce Thornton is a point guard, I think at times, he is not always going to push the pace. And that's what makes him great, right? He's able to read the game and slow it down and whatnot. But, I think there might be a future where we look back and say, wow, Bruce was great, but like this next point guard or this point guard now fit this better. And now they've got, instead of just one John Mobley who can shoot, they've got 2 or 3 guys who are shooting at a high level. They've got a big man who not only can play inside, but can stretch it out a little bit and things like that. Again, I go back to the Golden State Warriors, and I mean the Golden State Warriors when they were at their heyday. And, that's an unfair comparison because that's maybe one of the best basketball teams of all time. But I think that style of play is where the Buckeyes would like to get. Now, those are the 4 things. How do you get there? What do you do, not necessarily to make the Final Four next year, even though that would be great, but how do you build this into some combination of those? It starts in today's day and age with the transfer or with NIL and revenue sharing. And like I said, I think that is going to be in a better place going into next season. Jake Diebler talked about it on his radio show after the first weekend of the NCAA tournament and his confidence in it. People that I've talked to have said they feel confident in Ohio State, again, not being on the elite level when it comes to NIL, but certainly being more competitive. It starts with Jake Diebler, continuing to grow as a coach. I know there were disappointments this year. I know Jake Diebler has his critics. I understand it. And I think there are reasons to be critical at times, but I do think he took steps in terms of growing. If you ever get the chance to talk to Jake Diebler about basketball, it's clear that this guy knows the game, knows how to be a coach. He's young though. He took over a program, unlike Ryan Day, who was a young first-time head coach, that wasn't in the best spot. And so he's tried to build it, back up to where he thinks it could be. And, his standard is as high as everyone else's. I remember preseason when we met with the team for the first time at Media Day, and he talked about the standard being what's on the back wall of their practice gym, which is Final Four appearances, the national championship banner, players of the year, like all that stuff, all the accolades. He's not shying away from those expectations. And I think that's good because, a different coach might say, look, Ohio State basketball hasn't been that in years and years. This is going to take time to even get back to, being an NCAA tournament. No, Jake Diebler wants it just as bad as you do. And, it's not easy, but I do think that he's got a good grasp on it. But you got to do it, right? And I think this will be an interesting offseason to watch. And it's already started, which sort of brings me to my next point. You've seen Devin Royal enter the transfer portal. I wrote about this. You can read it on Bucknuts if you want more sort of in-depth breakdown of his decision and kind of the Buckeyes. But I think, and this was kind of the conclusion I came to, this is probably the best case scenario for all parties involved. I think Devin, having wanted to move to the 3 and playing, more on the perimeter because that's where his NBA career or professional career. I'm not sure Devin's going to be an NBA player. We'll see. What probably lies. Like that transition was okay this year. Not great, but okay. But now you've got a 5-star freshman coming in who probably fits some of the things I just mentioned in talking about those other teams a little bit better. And so was Devin squeezed out? No, I don't think that's it. But I think he recognized, the opportunity might be better somewhere else. I think the Buckeyes recognized, hey, this might be, a a situation where we're probably going to turn it over to Anthony Thompson at some point at that small forward position, and you go from there. And I think you're going to look back. Devin had a great 3 years at Ohio State, grew a lot, but the time has probably come for the parting of ways for both parties, like I said. So I think that now opens up some room for other things, right? Financially, you need space. Not only do you need a roster spot, but you need space. You got to replace Bruce Thornton. And like I said, I think there is a type of point guard that might fit better. Somebody who wants to sort of run and gun a little bit more. I don't know if you need an elite point guard to raise the Buckeye ceiling. Now, obviously, if you could go get somebody who, can do some of the things Bruce could do, but play at a quicker tempo and maybe even better, then great. But those guys will not come cheap. Can you find somebody who can run the offense, knock down open shots, make the passes, and be a leader out there? Like that, for me, is the floor of what the Buckeyes need to do in the transfer portal, looking for a point guard. Center, I think, is an interesting position because you have Josh Ojiwana coming back this offseason. We haven't seen him play at all for the Buckeyes because he was coming off that knee injury that happened 2 years ago now at Baylor. He's a guy who I've seen in warmups. He was obviously healthier at the end of the year, doing some very freakishly athletic stuff. At 6'10", he's a big guy. If he can get back to where he was 2 years ago, I think that's a pretty solid big man for Ohio State. Now, I say that his numbers, weren't crazy. And it was a big jump. Let me pull it up here in terms of what Josh averaged. His last year at Baylor, 7.4 points, 6.4 rebounds per game, shot 77.4%. Now, that was in 23 games. It wasn't a full season because he did get hurt, but it was a jump from the year before, 4.9 points, 3.4 rebounds per game while shooting 73%. So can he get back to where that was? And then he has to take a step. Or do you need to go get somebody at center in the transfer portal? And I think you should probably get somebody at center in the transfer portal anyway. And then you have two options there. Maybe somebody, because Josh isn't going to shoot a ton of threes, if at all. So could you go find somebody that is maybe more of a stretch player that complements him? I think that would be big. And then the bench for me is really the next thing they need to address. We talked about it all season long. Ohio State didn't get much of anything off his bench on a night-to-night basis. And I think you're going to see some of those guys enter the transfer portal and look for opportunity elsewhere. Those players that come in to replace them, you do have Alex Smith, the freshman, who I think is going to be, elevate your bench to some degree. But the guys you bring in the transfer portal, I think have to be better players. Like this has to keep going upward. And so, can you bring in guys that maybe on this past year's team might have started, but now it's like, okay, or maybe would have played more, but now you've got guys coming off the bench. Like you look at that Michigan, you look at any of these Final Four teams, and the guys they can bring off the bench. Ohio State pales in comparison. And so that needs to build. And I think there's the opportunity there. I really do. And, I was very optimistic about this year's Buckeye team. I think there were some reasons it didn't get, I think you saw as they got healthy at the end of the season, let's just call it what it is. You saw kind of the ceiling. Now, losing in the first round of the NCAA tournament, not at all what you would want. I thought this team would win that game. Obviously, then you're facing Duke, and that was probably the end of the road. But at least you won a game in the NCAA tournament. Instead, you got this hot team that ran into TCU and just couldn't get it done. But the way that they finished that season with the run they went on to elevate themselves to an 8th seed, that I thought was what we'd see more of this year, and a team that maybe could have contended for, the triple bye in the Big Ten. And so you've got a lot of work to do this offseason to get back to that place. But I think there are positive signs. I really do. And look, I try and tell people, I try to be honest about this. And, if I thought that the Buckeyes were going in the wrong direction and Jake Diebler was a guy who was in over his head and all that stuff, you would hear it from me. And so I do think that there are positives, but I think there are also things that you need to look at out there and why other teams have been so successful. When we're talking about these Final Four teams, Michigan, obviously they had the run with Trey Burke and those guys, but not a historically great college basketball program. The other ones, though, pretty good. And they've kind of established a culture of, making these runs. Illinois, this is the first Final Four in a long time, but they have been consistently a good team under Brad Underwood. Arizona obviously has, probably underachieved in the NCAA tournament based on what they've accomplished in the regular season. And then UConn, we talked about them. So I don't know if Ohio State can get back to that level. Obviously, when you get to the NCAA tournament, anything can happen. Illinois was a 3 seed. Could Ohio State strive to be that type of team next? Obviously, you want to be a 1 seed, but realistically, could Ohio State go from an 8 seed this year to a 3 seed next year and then see what happens in the tournament? I don't think that's out of the question. I think that's probably on the high side of expectations, but I do think that there is the possibility of that when you look at some of the changes they can make if they go and approach this offseason the right way. And that's going to be crucial. I don't think it's a make or break offseason for Jake Diebler, but I do think it needs to be a productive offseason so that you go into next season, with some optimism and people excited about the team and wanting to come out to games and all of those things that do really matter. And then you follow that up with some wins early in the season and you get into Big Ten play and you're playing well. And there's guys that people can get excited about on this roster. And I do think there will be. I think Omari Bynum is a guy that Buckeye fans should be really excited about coming back. John Mobley Jr. declares for the NBA draft. Let's be honest. I think unless something crazy happens, he'll be back too. I know people know him. He's not new and exciting, but I think his improvement these 2 years is a sign that he can get even better. And then I think that you kind of build around when you bring in an Anthony Thompson, who, I know Buckeye fans who haven't watched him are like excited he's a 5-star, but I think this is a kid, who can really do some things. Now, you saw in the McDonald's All-American game, if you watched that the other night, he's got some things he's got to work on this offseason. When he's playing against the elite competition, he will have to be better. So, you need to see that, especially early on now that you don't have a Devin Royal. But this is the type of player. If Ohio State can consistently get these type of guys once every other recruiting class, maybe even every recruiting class, and it doesn't even need to be a 5-star necessarily, but this kind of pedigree, that's going to be huge for this program going forward. So again, it's easy to be optimistic right now. It's, the off season, you're about to enter essentially free agency and whatnot. And we'll see what comes out on the other end and how this roster looks eventually. But the things that I'm hearing with Jake Diebler and the staff and stuff like that, I think there are reasons to be optimistic. I know not everyone's going to do that. It's got to be proven. And look, I fully get that. They have not played at a high level in quite some time. And so I understand people that want to see it first before they become believers, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up. This was a shorter show. I just wanted to hit on these Final Four teams and where I think Ohio State can, sort of learn from those teams and do that all before the Final Four games kick off this weekend. We'll be back next week, back talking football, talking spring practice. This was a little veer off the normal path on the Bucknuts Happy Hour, but thank you all for tuning in. Again, watching this on YouTube, please hit that thumbs up button, hit the bell for notifications so you get all of our videos, not just our podcasts. And if you are listening to this on your podcast platform of choice, please leave us a 5-star review, comments, all that good stuff. Appreciate it, Buckeye fans. Cheers.